So this is a class in holding possibilities in solution as you build a story. And it's a specific technique that you want to have as a habit as you build a story in general. But what I'm focusing on at this point is a specific part of the development process. So if this is the whole script, what I'm talking about is really like the creation and development part of a story where everything is wide open and you're spinning up possibilities, developing story options, and having to fit everything together as you create, invent, and develop. One of the underlying principles in terms of this kind of training program is to stay fluid as long as you can so that you're flexible, you're open ended, and it enables you to feel out possibilities and have a kind of a floating outline. So you always want to be fluid throughout the entire creation process, but the earlier part of the actual process of building the story, and this timeline is for the actual like building of the story, where at first there's a lot of invention and brainstorming and playing with possibilities. It's not all that complicated. It's just a specific technique. And we're going to be building a real story to demonstrate it in action. So you'll get some experience with the tools and you'll also illustrate these principles and techniques in action. So the process is keeping everything loose and being able to hold a set of possibilities in suspension or tentative possibilities in suspension as you dream up a story, wrestle up some of the dynamic possibilities, think it through, figure it out, tie it all together. And so we're kind of getting up to the point where you tie it all together. That's where some of this would change. I have a raw idea that I thought through a little bit that has some complexity to it so that we can be developing elements of the story, and we'll be working with several tools. So we'll be working with dilemma, the Enneagram, the 36 dramatic situations, brainstorming, pure storytelling, and we may not do much research today, but in general, you would be doing that in this phase of a story. I know that many of you have been through enough of these tools that I don't want to bog it down to explain all these tools right now. I'll give a quick overview, but this is intended to be part of a program where you have some exposure to these tools. So dilemma is just the protagonist trapped between two equally unacceptable alternatives, and the crisis is where that dilemma comes to a critical juncture and forces a decision and action. The Enneagram is a personality profiling system that once you have a basic dilemma up and running for your story, and it's a dilemma for the protagonist, then the personality profile of that protagonist affects the dilemma, because different personality types will react and interact differently with any given dilemma. So someone who is a 3 and is really intent on being a high achiever and really cares about how they appear to others will react to a certain type of dilemma in a way that's different from how a type 8 would react, or a type 5 or a type 6. Each has their own tendencies, strengths, basic fears, and so on. The 36 dramatic situations are a set of elements to brainstorm with, and brainstorming is just explosive creation of story possibilities. Pure storytelling is just pure seat of the pants, making stuff up. Research is digging into things, seeing what some options are, exploring possibilities, normal research as a storyteller. Collecting your wits, just you'll see that as we get into our story, sometimes you just have to sit there and wrap your brain around the idea and think through the ramifications and play with it. And really, that should be in here too. That's kind of part of a number of these. but it's also a distinct thing. And then connecting the dots. What I'm talking about here with staying fluid and flexible as you explore ideas, develop ideas, really it's about story invention. There's going to be a number of major components in a new story that you want to keep fluid and flexible as long as you can so they're not getting poured in concrete too soon. You want things open-ended. So the analogy that I use sometimes is, say that you are designing a submarine, like a modern like warfare submarine from scratch, and it doesn't exist yet, and it's an entirely new design. So you're not just engineering and building the same basic thing that gets built, but like a new story, they have new parameters, new things they want, new things they want to try out. So you have a whole bunch of different systems. It has to be, capable of going down extremely deep. It needs very substantial electronic capabilities, command and control. It has a drive system that has to be fully operational. It has weapons systems that have to be fully operational, life support systems, communication systems. So all these different things that are being invented because it's like a next generation. So you're pushing the envelope here and there. It's not just rehashing what was already there. So I'm using this as an analogy for building a new story where you have a constellation of different elements that have to be all considered together. And each of them has to be grown and developed, and it all has to fit into the whole thing. So in a story, you have the raw idea. You're looking at the dilemma, which might, be one of these components, building to a crisis, which is an extension of the dilemma. The Enneagram, who this person is, what makes them tick, how they think, how they feel, what their basic fears are, all that stuff is another component in the story. Just raw ideas you're coming up with, pure storytelling, research. All of these things are growing, changing. It's a dynamic system with a bunch of things that are working in concert to create a whole creature. It's really partly the ability to float possibilities, float a handful of possibilities in your mind as you're kind of conjuring this story into existence, playing with possibilities, exploring options. And really what it is, you're feeling out the possibilities, seeing how various possibilities intersect with the story's trajectory. And you're seeing where these possibilities intersect with junctions in the story where these possibilities can become probabilities. This is not a storyline, but this is the process of our story creation. You start with a raw idea, and then you just start playing with it, and there's some dynamic possibilities, and you're basically feeling out the possibilities in the story. And you're seeing how various possibilities might play out. If I go one way with it, then this will happen, and at this point in the story, something like this might happen. And you might have several strong possibilities for what could happen at a certain juncture in the story. You're feeling your way through the story's probable trajectory, like looking like where it's going to go. And you're seeing where some of these possibilities might become probabilities. Like, wow, I might really use that, but I still have 3 or 4 other things that could really happen. I think the simplest thing to do at this point would be to bring out the story idea that I have. This is an idea that I came up with just yesterday. I like to come to a class where we're building a story reasonably empty-handed. In other words, it's not all figured out yet, because the process of figuring out is the best way to learn. So I'm not just trotting out an idea that I've already figured out and walking you through the mechanics of it. I'm doing it with you, in front of you, on the spot. I put some time into this story because I wanted it to have a degree of complexity. I didn't want it to be a single-celled organism, which is what a raw idea often is. It's just a fun idea. I had an idea, and what I did was I played with it for about 2 hours last night and stumbled into an interesting complexity for it. And so basically what I have is a raw idea and a complication for it. And it's something we can really play with. So we'll be building a real story and making tentative choices, holding possibilities in suspension, playing with options, really entertaining an array of possibilities rather than just a few simple possibilities. This is a weird thriller, and I stumbled onto it yesterday, played with it a bit, and actually moved the story along one notch. So there's some complexity. So here's the raw idea. A woman wakes up out of a drug-induced coma to find that she's in a captive breeding program with several other women. So it's a science fiction type thriller, and you've seen these type of things before where someone has been cloned and a dying billionaire is harvesting their organs, that type of thing. But this is one step beyond that. It's actually several steps beyond it, but really in the most simple terms, it's one step beyond it. So because I'm making this up on the fly, the idea is partially formed in several different ways. Like I had the raw idea and then I played with one option, played with another, and played with another. And that's about all there is at this point. But the essence of it is that our woman wakes up and she's with, like, say, 5 other women in this kind of breeding lab. So each of these is a woman who's basically been kidnapped, kept in a drug-induced coma, made pregnant with twins of clones of billionaires. Basically, there was like some kind of electric short. And so this one group of women accidentally got awakened from their drug-induced coma. And what I played with is that they call this collection of 6 women a motherboard. And so in the bigger system here, they say like they burned out a motherboard. So like these 6 woke up. The essence of what I'm playing with is that they play dead. They pretend they're still out, but at night they sneak around to try and figure out what's happening. And they find out that they're part of a much larger system that might have upwards of 10,000 women. They just might be in one of these motherboards. They're basically kept pregnant with twins. You know, it's a fertility type clinic, and they're implanted with fertilized twins that are clones of different billionaires and sheiks and stuff like that. So they decide to escape. But in the process of doing that, they have to collect their wits first, figure out where they are, what's happening, and our protagonist hacks into the system and finds out some of the basics of what's going on. And they plan an escape, but because they've been in a coma on their backs and they're pregnant, they don't have any muscle tone. So they can't move well. They can barely stand up. This is where the second piece, I said I came up with one thing for the story and came up with one more thing. So this one more thing is that it's not just that they're harvesting organs for these dying billionaires, but it comes from recent news on brain science. And I did a little bit of research on this last night. What they're starting to talk about in brain science is how they think there is one part of the brain, or maybe 2 parts of the brain, one gland in the brain, and maybe the cerebral cortex, which could be a lobe of the brain, is the seat of the consciousness. So what that means, what I'm playing with in a science fiction way, is that they can literally surgically remove this from a person's brain the parts of the brain, the lobes of the brain that contain the consciousness of the person and transplant that into the clone. It's a brain lobe transplant. Do you know how the liver is made up of several different lobes? Like it's literally like parts that you can peel back that are separate and part of it. And people sometimes don't get a liver transplant, they just get a liver lobe transplant. Brain transplants don't work, but they have successfully transplanted brain lobes. So this is part of the article. A piece of brain has been successfully transplanted from one mouse into another, where it not only survived, but also correctly hooked itself up and functioned almost normally, a New York scientist reported. This is what I call my science fiction experiment, except that it works. Chief of endocrinology succeeded in 7 of 8 attempts. They're not speculating about what they can do with humans, but that's all it was. And what we're saying is that, and this is a totally science fiction scenario, if the billionaire is dying, they take the part of that billionaire's brain in which that billionaire's consciousness resides and implant it into the brain of one of the adult clones. So what that means is that if it is the seat of consciousness, they're taking the you out of you and putting it into someone else. So that this billionaire now is this healthy young clone of him or herself, now has a 22-year-old body and resides in that body. Now, there's already a person living in that brain, but I didn't get any further with that because I want us to play with it. So when I said that this woman and the 5 other women in what they call the motherboard, where these 6 women are all pregnant with twins, they're in a drug-induced coma, some kind of glitch, they call it burned out the motherboard, these wake up, but they didn't get spotted and they're trying to escape, but their bodies are completely out of shape. And when they find out that they are putting the seat of consciousness into these clones, and these clones, by the way, are like basically the children of these mothers and all the other mothers, because there's a lot of them and it's a major breeding program. The clones are worker bees. I mean, they would be hunting and trying to kill these women. And so what these women do is they do the same thing to themselves. They extract this seat of consciousness in themselves, put it into a new body to try to escape. So that's the essence. So everybody please unmute and let's play with this idea.
You said that they plant the seed of consciousness into someone else.
No, they plant their consciousness into someone else. What they're talking about these days in science is that brain scientists are beginning to narrow down where the consciousness of a person resides, like it's in a particular lobe of the brain or a gland or a section of the brain. And like, if you take that out, it's you. You would be awake in that body. You would be in that body. Does that make sense?
Yes. So are they doing it to preserve themselves?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's not just to preserve themselves, but because they've been in here, you know, they might have been in here for 10 years. Their baby making factory, and they just crank out a set of twins every year and they never wake up. They're in a drug-induced coma. It's a captive breeding program. It's slavery. You know, it's science.
Sort of like a puppy mill.
Yeah, except 1,000 times worse.
Right.
In the beginning of Kill Bill, when she wakes up in a drug-induced coma and they're having sex with her and selling her out and all that stuff, it's like that, very much like that. They may have been in there for 6 years. So like, I remember when I was 13 and I had the mumps and they wouldn't let me get out of bed. When I got out of bed after 2 weeks, my knees crumbled. I went to the ground. I was like, because I lost all that muscle tone. So they're free, but they're not going to be jumping over buildings and fighting armed guards to get out of there. Our woman hacks into, you know, like sneaking around at night, hacks into and finds out what they're doing. they're implanting the seed of consciousness from themselves into the brain of a clone of them.
Yeah.
And then they now reside in a 22-year-old body.
Well, what if the reason that they awaken is because they've been there for such a long time, their bodies are worn out, so the surgeons have cloned the women themselves and are getting a new body grown so the women can continue, or the clones of the women who are the original vessels or incubators become the next generation of incubators.
It's interesting. So then they would literally have a clone of themselves.
Right. The thing is, either they're going to have to find a rogue doctor who's sick to death of the ethics of this thing and will help them escape, and he or she is planning to do this one by one or however many she can get away with, or there's a process to continue this hell for another generation or two or three or four, so you wind up with 10 billion geniuses of the financial world, because now we're going off planet. They want to extend their consciousness, maybe 4 or 5 at a time, to distant planets if we want to spin this out, into the cosmos.
I think that's interesting. See, this is what this class is about, is holding possibilities in suspension. 2 major possibilities that could go in different directions. So one of them is that they're utterly disposable and they're going to be thrown out like yesterday's garbage when their shelf life is up. And, some glitch just triggered a change in their chemistry and they woke up from their coma. It was like an accident. And it happens every now and then. They call it burning out a motherboard, and they just dispose of them. But these are like lab rats that are fighting back, that are trying to escape. That is more dystopian and more kind of grim, that they're just like, thrown out like yesterday's fish or something like that.
Thinking about James's idea, what popped into my mind with regards to peak and how if you overstimulate that part of the brain that grows stronger and then other parts grow weaker, maybe these parts of the brains that are being fashioned through the consciousness are to solve the current world problems. So it's more of, like you said, a genetic design, not just for the billionaires, but maybe to help solve some of the problems that are facing mankind.
Right. I like the idea because it's interesting and it's very open-ended and there's a whole lot of possibilities. They're basically creating a new race, but still, if there are 10,000 of these women and each of them creates 2 genetically enhanced twins each year, then 20,000 people a year who might all be like clones of Elon Musk, and he's going to send them to Mars to inhabit it. If only there was 2 of me. Well, what if there was 10 of me? What if there was 10,000 of me?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the breeding women are not treated like livestock. In other words, they might be valued and cloned and be high priestesses where they're the creators and they're honored and they're cloned periodically.
There'd be a genetic selection. The better incubators are the ones who are cloned and let the other ones drop away. So there's a cycle of improvement, a waterfall effect, if you're familiar with software development.
Yep.
Doing sprints.
Right. It's selective breeding. Yes.
Selective breeding as part of it.
Within them, they're trying to take their consciousness and put it in someone else to protect or preserve or whatever. One of the women says, I don't want to do it because I want to experience being a billionaire, but they have to do it as a motherboard together. Like they all have to do it as one. They can't have anyone in conflict with the implanting of their consciousness. Like they all have to be in agreement.
Right. That brings up another whole thing. If the breeding women are being cloned, that means there would be a new body that could keep breeding, but they don't care if that woman's personality, who she is, like you wake up in a new body and it's still you.
Right.
you still remember where you hid your skates when you were 9 years old, so your brother wouldn't, draw on them, like that kind of thing. But if they're merely cloning these women, then all they need is the body. They don't need that woman to be Bessie McGillicuddy. It's an it. Like if you can put some neurons of Elon Musk into 10,000 of the brains, so this one thinks it's Elon Musk, this one thinks it's Elon Musk, and they're all out there working in concert, that's different than the breeding stock. But that also brings up another question, which you touched upon a minute ago, which is that if somebody's a clone, then they're going about their business, and then they wake up and there's now, how would that work? I don't really know. It's not a brain transplant. But the one note I wrote for that was, what happens to the clone personality that's in that body? Well, one answer from the dying billionaires is, who cares? I got the body now. I'm going to run this joint. That's just one possible answer, is nobody gives a fuck what happens to that person and to their personality. This is like an invasive species, and they're going to run the joint. They're going to take it over. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to work, but you can see how there's multiple possibilities here for where this story could go. Is this making sense to you guys?
I'm just curious about the protagonist and what happens that sets her apart from the others.
Yeah. It's her story. Let's give her a name.
Well, I also have a quick question. This is Lauren. With all the birthing, wouldn't there at some point perhaps be like birth defects, like autism or brain issues that people aren't fully aware of until the body's inhabited?
Well, I would think that they would be screening for that. Like, I hadn't thought of that. And you'd think they would be screening for that, culling the defects. It would be like livestock. It would be like, this one has a brain defect. This one has a club foot. Throw them in the blender. You know what I mean? It's like Soylent Green. It's selective breeding. Raina is the protagonist. She wakes up, gets mobile enough to hack into the system, and learns what they're up to. And she's with this group of other women and says, hey, we got to get the hell out of here. We're like jellyfish. We haven't stood up in 7 years, some of us, or something. Maybe they've all been in there that long. So she says they're raising babies in us that are clones of these billionaires and so on. But the real secret is that the billionaires that are dying are putting their seat of consciousness into a clone of themselves, so they keep on living as themselves in a new, young, healthy body that's been genetically enhanced. We are going to do the same thing to try to get out of here. One of the obvious questions is Raina a brain surgeon? Which she probably isn't. But if the technology is sufficiently advanced, then there may be a way to, with a non-invasive laparoscopic automated surgery, like come in and harvest the seat of consciousness. Maybe it turns out to be something the size of a lima bean, some gland in our brain, and that's where the you in you actually resides. And if you take that out, put it in somebody else, then you are in that body. The you is in that body.
What if that were to act like when you grow crystals, you take a small crystal and put it into a solution, and then those grow, so that if bits and pieces of these glands are seeded,
yes,
you could have 100 at a time or 1,000 at a time. Not, because if you have to transplant the whole thing, it's only one clone at a time becomes a billion.
Yes. And like when I showed up this morning, I had, they take one, Elon Musk, who's now, 98 and dying, gets himself in a brand new body, and he's off to Mars. And that's great. He's like, I'm back. I don't know if Elon Musk wasted his youth, but for many people, youth is wasted on the young. Like they laid around and drank beer when they could have really been doing some cool stuff. And when they get to be 90, they're like, God, did I waste a couple of decades? Holy crap. Give me that back. But the idea was starting to occur to me as I was talking to you, and especially when I was describing like tens of thousands of them, if what can be harvested I think it's how certain species can reproduce like this. Like, say this is the seat of consciousness and it's the size of a lima bean. And you can get into it like with a pipette. It's almost like a little surgical gun that an amateur can operate. And if it's robot assisted, then it goes right in with an MRI and gets right in the right place. And you either take the whole lima bean, which is again one possibility, or you take enough of it that it thinks it's you. And when it gets put into a new body, you're like, wahoo, I'm in a 22-year-old athlete's body. Let's get rolling here. If you can take seeds and they will propagate, and see, that's the thing that let me get some of this down. Take the whole gland and put it into someone else. Now you're you in that new body.
But Raina, something failed, so she's herself, right?
No, she is livestock who is breeding the clones for the master race.
Oh, what I was envisioning, and maybe I misunderstood, is that she's going to rebel because something went awry with her injection of her consciousness. So now she's going to be ethical and try to fight.
That's conceivably one possible trajectory of this story, but that's not the basic premise that I was starting with. But let me just get this idea down here. Take some cells that contain, you can either take the whole gland and then you got one more Elon Musk or whoever, or you can take enough cells that those cells see themselves as Elon Musk. You put that into the brain of the clone host and they propagate there. I think starfish grow like that, some jellyfish. A certain number of cells will grow into the whole organism again. But the thing that I was thinking, like, what happens to the person that used to live in that brain? Well, there could be drugs that enable the new person to dominate and then start to shut down the old person. Make the clone recede. Okay, so I wasn't seeing the mothers as special who got their personality put into a new thing. They're just like women who've been kidnapped, who have good genes, who are put into drug-induced coma and bred until they're used up and then they're thrown away, or they could be cloned again. But their consciousness is not transferred from one to the other. But they're doing that as a way to escape. She's like, this is what they're up to and this is what they're capable of. So I got one of these guns and here's a robot that's going to do this to each of us. Each of us is going to get put into a clone. So we'll have a young, healthy body so we can get the hell out of here. Now, maybe they want to try to free everybody, or maybe they barely make it out themselves. See, that's where the story could go. What we're doing at this point is just establishing raw possibilities for how to even get the story kicked off. Have I incorporated what everybody's said so far? I think we're holding all those threads still.
Well, if at some point the embryos in these women have developed to a certain level where they now have a brain stem and they have the brain basically formed, could then these seeds be placed into the unborn child in utero? The kid hasn't experienced life yet.
Right. So you're not displacing another personality.
Right. It just like infects the forming brain with the consciousness already there. Maybe the kid comes out talking and doing quadratic equations, on the second day after birth.
Maybe these consciousness cells doesn't sound right, but seat of consciousness are implanted into the fetus so that each one, I see what you're saying, so that when it's born, it's not a brand new version of Elon Musk that's never done anything. It remembers where Elon Musk hid his thing when he was 9 years old. He knows all his passwords.
It's kind of like the racial memory in Dune.
But racial memory is different than it's me, Jeff Kitchen, in this new body, and I still have the same hobby. Maybe that's further down the line. I don't know, where you have a full-blown operational genius billionaire being born. So it's like, I can't wait until I can walk so I can get something real done here. I'm busy. I don't have time to lay around in my own wet diapers.
Where I'm a little confused is like, it seems like everything is focused on the insertion and the planting of the seeds of the consciousness by these women. They're doing this in order to escape. Once they've done this, what happens to the old bodies? Like,
well, the old bodies, they leave them behind. And like, if you take the whole gland, then that body, it's no longer you. And it would probably wither and die. If this is a normal thing that happens in this big breeding facility, another motherboard burned out, okay, we'll take them down to the incinerator. These are getting their consciousness out of their bodies and into fresh clones so that they can escape. Maybe they're leaving part of themselves in their old bodies, but they're them in their new bodies. But the essence of it is that they wake up in here, they figure out what's going on. Their bodies are in terrible shape. They're not jumping over any walls. So they do this thing that they have, put their consciousness into new young clones and try to escape. That's the basics of what we're up to.
So they can physically escape. It's their bodies. The conflict is maybe in trying to plant their seeds in each.
No, I would see that if this is the whole story, I would see that they probably achieved that somewhere maybe around the end of Act 1. See how that's like an interesting act break where like they've woken up, figured out what's going on, hacked into the system, realized, wow, they have this option. Maybe we could do this. And they actually are like, wow, we got young bodies, but we still got to get out of here. Or maybe they don't know who we are yet. They don't know what's happened yet. I don't know. It's like literally not made up. It doesn't exist yet. But the one thing that I was playing with, and it's just another option, is we talked about how there's the clone is already residing in the body, and then they put some dying sheik in the body. So there's literally two personalities in that brain. One of them wants to go work out, and one of them wants to get on his computer and check his stocks.
That reminds me of a book I read called Old Souls, and it was the study of children who remembered past lives of people like in India, and they had like they just remembered it all. So is it the consciousness or it is the person's soul?
Well, that's what we're saying for the sake of this science fiction, is that the seat of consciousness is literally where the soul resides.
Right.
If you picked this thing up, if you took this out of a person's brain and you like put it through an MRI, or you even hooked it up to audio visual, you could say, hey, Mike, is that you in there? And it would say, yeah, it's me. Where the fuck am I?
Yeah.
It's almost like the man with two brains, where he's got the brains in the different jars. And it's like, well, we're putting you in a new body. Just wanted to make sure you were good. Like, yeah, I'm here. I can't see anything. I'm dreaming like crazy, and I smell weird things. It's almost like you had a stroke or something, like all this. You don't even know what's happening. And there's weird things happening. You might have to learn how to walk and talk when you're back in your new body, because it's a different set of coordinates or something. But it's you. It's literally you. The thing that I was playing with, because we talked about how there could be two people in the same brain. Well, what if as they're in the process of their escape and they have this like robot that's laparoscopically removing their seat of consciousness to put it into their clone, and maybe some guards are coming or something's going wrong, or the robot starts to malfunction. So all they has time for is to put all of their consciousnesses into one clone. So like there's 6 women inside this one clone. That could be a comedy. That clone could become a deity in the end. It could be omniscient. It could be all powerful. It could think circles around everybody. or it could be goofy, funny. And the person who ends up marrying this woman think he married somebody with multiple personality disorder or something. What we're talking about at this point is holding possibilities in suspension with different parallel storylines. And that's a skill in and of itself, to be able to juggle possibilities. That's all it really is. And what we're not doing, you'll notice, is taking one of these and going, oh, that's it. Let's start to pour concrete. Because it's very much like working with an architect when you're designing your house. It's a really good analogy, because if you and your spouse sit down to design, your dream house with the architect, then you're going to be saying, okay, we want a pool over here. We want an underground garage down here. We want a tree house as part of the house for the kids to have a super time in, and I want an indoor greenhouse. And as the architect, and your husband might say, but, well, what about the whole roof deck, tanning salon? You're really like trying different things. And the architect comes back with plans and says, well, the treehouse didn't work out entirely. We can only make it this high. And the pool actually has to be over here because of, the sewage lines, and the underground parking can't go 2 stories down. There's city ordinances. So there's things like you're adjusting and you're playing, and there's possibilities. And at the last minute, you decide to put a crow's nest up on the roof because your 9-year-old's now really into pirates. But it's not until the architect shows up with the final plans and you sign off on them that the contractor can actually build anything at all. Until that point, it's just a set of possibilities and tentative choices. Now they're gelling, but they don't crystallize until you go, that is the thing we're building. Then the builder knows, okay, I'm going out and buying 90 pounds of nails and 312 feet of electrical wiring. They know exactly, like down to the last screw, what goes in that house. Now that's not true with the screenplay, because you're constantly inventing as you go along. But at a certain point you go, okay, that's the story we're telling. But at a certain point earlier in the process, you're just entertaining possibilities and holding possibilities in suspension, juggling like, well, what if all 6 women are in one brain? Those types of possibilities, that's the essence of what we're training in today. And one of the things that my students will hear me say every now and then, if we're talking about an idea, because in course 2, we're doing this all the time. We're constantly building story ideas from scratch, playing around with them, trying things on, doing exercises with them. Like a student might say, well, what if we do this? And I would say, well, yeah, we could do that. But inherent in that idea is another half dozen possibilities as well. So what I'm seeing usually, or I have the ability from doing this for a long time, is to hold multiple possibilities in my head for many of the aspects of the story, so that where someone who's less trained in this will see 1 or 2 possibilities, I might see 5 or 6. So I'm not really seeing one thing. I'm seeing that plus, yeah, there's these other possibilities that kind of go with that and could function there as well. So it's partly just training your brain to stay plastic and flexible and resisting the urge to pour it in concrete too soon, because there may be hundreds of stories in the raw material, and you may end up with a great plot instead of a superficial one by questioning and cross-questioning everything. So you want to keep it fluid as long as possible and flexible.
What if 2 of the consciousness were from arch enemies that were implanted into the women? So
yeah, that's great. Or, what if one of them gets captured and they put like the Gestapo leader into her brain? I mean, does that even constitute a spy? What does it mean if there's 2 warring people inside the same brain?
And what if someone had been holding on to Einstein's consciousness and nobody knew it?
Absolutely. That's the kind of stuff to play with. Or that, you probably couldn't get Einstein's because I would think you'd have to extract this from a living person, but maybe they had the technology to extract the seat of consciousness before they had the technology to implant it in anybody. In other words, maybe they figured out 30 years ago how to take that out of somebody, and only in the last 7 years have they figured out how to actually implant it into somebody. So they may have a whole library of great minds that have died in the last 30 years. I want to put David Bowie in my brain before we leave. They got some of him here.
Yeah.
That's the process that instead of jumping right to, okay, so they stick Carl Sagan's brain in themselves, that just becomes another possible, not tangent, but parallel set of possibilities.
What if, as a part of the escape, the billionaires become live and their bodies betray themselves? Like the billionaires are like, oh my God, I'm in a 22-year-old body. I can do jumping jacks and I could do cartwheels. And as they're trying to escape and try to move forward, the billionaires are like, no, I want to do a backflip. Can I do a backflip?
Well, yeah, they would be able to do that. Yeah. It's like waking up in a dream. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to have sex with all these people. I'm going to eat cheeseburgers. I've been on a freaking salt-free diet for the last 20 years while I've been dying of this. I'm going to go eat hot dogs at the ball game. Like, you can do anything. I mean, that's the whole point. What if one of the enemies catches one of the escaping young women clones and puts his or her into it to become they've kind of gone undercover. They're probably not going to run up to them right away and try to shoot them. They're probably going to infiltrate them and then try to take them down when they're the most vulnerable or something. It's one possible question.
If they are jellyfish, their seat of consciousness is moved to new bodies.
Yep.
Who actually moves them because they are jellyfish? They can't do it themselves.
Right. What I'm seeing is like our Raina, who's one of these 6 women in this, like they could all just be in a room together in hospital beds, but basically like gets in a wheelchair and goes around and gets on a computer. So it's not like they're incapable of anything, but they probably couldn't walk. It'd almost be like you're paralyzed and you get out of a bed and into a wheelchair or something like that, and then gets around, hacks into a computer and is like, holy crap, this is what they're up to. And we can use the implanting of the seat of consciousness into a young body to try to get out of here.
This seems like a very valuable software. Is there certain government laws encoded into the software, and where like the clones is essentially
which software?
Like cloning, just being able to go from a millionaire to a clone? It seems like that would be a very lucrative kind of thing that the company or the government would be interested in. So I was wondering, is there in a way like a copyright from the government or certain rules the government or that company would like to impose on that new clone or individual? So you're essentially the same person, but like maybe what you do as a clone or your thoughts or your emotions or your own body are copywritten by the people who own you.
I don't know. I think that it's the like dying billionaires who kind of run a lot of stuff anyway.
Right. But since they're dying, isn't this like a great time for the government or a company to kind of own them since they're already going to be dead?
Sure, that's a good idea. I'm not discounting your idea. I'm saying that generally in that type of scenario, the billionaires often tell the government what to do rather than the government pushing them around. Do you get what I'm saying?
Sure.
Like just because Elon Musk is 88 years old doesn't mean a bunch of senators are going to come in and bully him around.
Right.
He's like, you don't tell me what to do. I tell you what to do.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Well,
So like I would think that they would be the ones who own this stuff. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't proprietary software, but a clone, I think, is really just fertility medicine. I think you can like get some DNA, fertilize an egg or something like that. I mean, it just starts with a single-celled organism.
okay.
That's the same as you. And when it grows up, it'll look just like you.
All right. Because I could
Right.
definitely see someone wanting to hijack Elon Musk's.
That's definitely doable, but I don't think that the government would come in and go, oh, now that they're knocked down, let's take over.
Okay.
I would think that it would kind of be the opposite. that the billionaires would run the show and the government probably might try to impose some ethics on it, but really bends to
Right.
whatever the billionaires want.
What if another country's billionaires wants to take
Right.
those?
That's what I was thinking, like another billionaire or someone who can match him monetarily.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that's another whole set of parameters. In other words, like, what did these women wake up in the middle of?
Mm,
Because it's the kind of thing where, like, you can do a home invasion and you might get a harmless old couple with a bunch of cash in their house and a whole bunch of food, and you can sit there and live the life of Riley for months and you hit the jackpot. Or you might do a home invasion and the guy you picked just got out of prison and is like a famous serial killer, and you broke into the wrong damn house. So that, like, these guys wake up in a breeding program that's like at war with another breeding program in Japan, and there's sabotage and theft and the planet is dying, and you know what I mean? It's like there's all kinds of possibilities. You know, is this like something out of the Matrix where it's all done by machines and the people are just batteries? They're making worker bees. I don't know. You know, there's 1,000 different ways you can go with this. That's what we're talking about here, is holding possibilities in suspension as you consider different possible trajectories for the story. There's literally 100 different ideas in this raw thing. So let's now go to the 36 dramatic situations, because that opens up a whole set of possibilities here. And for those of you interested in like taking the full program, course 2, this is like a normal day at work for us in course 2. We haven't even talked about dilemma yet. We're just looking at raw possibilities. And we're really talking about the subject of the class, which is holding an array of possibilities in suspension as you consider where this story might go, or if in fact it turns into 2 or even 3 different scripts. Like, there might be a great science fiction novel inherent in this. There may be a whacked out comedy. We talked about what if all 6 personalities of the woman got put into one brain. You know, there could be an escape thriller where they get these bodies and they're trying to get away. Let's look at the 36. For instance, conflict with a god is very central to this story. They're up against a great power. Rivalry of superior and inferior. The enigma, the riddle, the mystery. How do we get out of this? What the hell is going on here? Who am I? Disaster is in this story. Pursuit.
daring enterprise as well.
Absolutely. It's daring enterprise in multiple ways. It's daring of the billionaires. It's daring of the women. Abduction is in this. Obtaining is in it, but that's kind of obvious. Falling prey to cruelty or misfortune is in there. Madness, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, it's a mad scientist story. And these women, they're not going to wake up and go, oh, I had the most wonderful dream. It's a living nightmare. They probably don't remember who they are. They probably feel like they just had a stroke. It's like, it's insane. So ambition in a number of ways. And then there's things like fatal imprudence, erroneous judgment, remorse or lack of remorse, and enemy loved is very interesting. Like, I don't even know what that would be. I want to think about that. That would probably mean that one of people who is slated to be their enemy cares about them, helps them. I don't know. You know, maybe to these clones, these mothers hold a special place in their hearts, even though they're not supposed to. It's like a forbidden religion or something like that. You're the mothers. And they bring all their friends, like, we got to help the mothers get out. That's a raw possibility. Or it can also be an enemy love can be being in love with an enemy, falling in love with an enemy, respect for an enemy, fascination with an enemy, growing respect for an enemy, discovery of the dishonor of a loved one. You know, if they find out that one of them actually is an enemy brain, and just finding out what's been done to them. And, you know, did somebody sell them into this slavery? Remorse would be in there somewhere. Utter lack of remorse by like the people that are doing this. Slaying of a kinsman unrecognized is interesting because it's the idea that these women feel slain and unrecognized. Obstacles to love would be in here. Animosity between kin, deliverance, absolutely, rescue or an attempt to rescue. Plus, this whole breeding program might be an attempt to save the human race. One possibility might be that these women go through this whole escape, and there's various possibilities along the way. See, even as I'm like following this one idea out, as I'm getting there, I'm going, well, there could be that possibility, or it could go that way. I'm like seeing like 3 or 4 possibilities as I even try to get to the point to tell you what I'm even thinking here. What if they wake up in this breeding program and it's nightmarish and horrible and like Hitler-esque, and they're fighting like crazy to get out of there, and people are trying to stop them from getting out, and they finally get out and discover that the earth is barren and is like an absolute wasteland, and the surface of the planet is, like 180 degrees, and the oceans are evaporating, and there's constant tsunamis and earthquakes and mega tornadoes everywhere. Like the planet went bananas and the human race was mostly wiped out, and that this is actually like an emergency breeding program to resurrect enough people to save the human race, so that what they thought was like a monstrous, horrific thing is really just a desperate attempt by scientists to create enough people, even just to get to Mars, to inhabit the colony that got set up there, or whatever. It's kind of the opposite of like the ending, like Soylent Green is people like discovering at the end that it's this horrific thing. It could be that they get to the end and discover that it's this incredible, like the most advanced scientific enterprise in the history of the human race. And instead of being like livestock, they're revered as the goddess mothers, and they're part of the birth, the saving of the whole human race. And all of that came from thinking about deliverance. These women are trying to rescue themselves from their situation, but the people who created this program are also trying to save themselves. And then I thought, well, what if they're trying to save the human race? And literally this idea led to this idea. And as I was trying to even explain it to you, I had another 3 or 4 ideas. So it's the process of fluid, but holding possibilities.
Or maybe war and an elite, they've assembled an elite consciousness who would be kind of like Band of Brothers or something to send to war.
Or maybe they were the top physical and mental specimens that could be found among all of humankind, and they were bred for their brilliance and their stamina, and that they are mankind's last hope. And maybe they go back in voluntarily and let's do another 10 years. I'm really into this. I misunderstood everything. I was completely disoriented when I woke up. Maybe they almost destroy it. That was one of the thoughts as I was trying to get to the point where I could say to you, what if they get out and realize that it's all this amazing thing? So one of the ideas is like, well, what if they were about to destroy the whole thing? Or what if they're trying to get all the other women out? Or what if, it's a massive revolt and they're going to burn the whole thing down? There's different possibilities occurring to me, even as I just get to this thing. So it's exactly what I was talking about. I'm not seeing just one possibility. I'm seeing 3 or 4 at the same time, and they're all floating there as possibilities. And that's where you just fill up a notebook. You write all that down. You write this one out. What if they were about to unplug all the women to put them out of their misery? What if they were trying to get a whole bunch of them out? What if they were going to burn the place down? And then in the end, they find out that, oh my God, it's like a religious experience for them to find out what's really being done. And they are like the highest goddesses in the history of the human race. And they are revered, and they may have propagated enough humans to go live on Mars, because everything on Earth, like the Earth is coming apart. But these are all just raw possibilities.
Right. Maybe they eliminated the whole male species and it's just all women.
Yeah, that could be too. They're like Amazon goddesses. The men might be the ones that are slaves. They're just sperm machines, or maybe it's just frozen sperm, or maybe they don't even need that. Maybe it's just DNA science. Men have become obsolete.
Yeah.
But you can see how, like, coming out of one raw idea, there's like a number of major possible trajectories, and we're not precluding any of them, because this one where men are obsolete could totally be its own whole movie. And this one where it's a thriller and they're just barely getting out of there could be its own movie. In fact, the raw idea for this started out, it was so dark that I discarded the beginning idea, but it was that a group of women who are paraplegics who are trapped in this breeding program wake up and try to get out of it. So, like, they don't even have the use of their legs and they're struggling to get out. And I was like, okay, at first I liked it because, like, okay, that's dark and screwed up and warped and not your normal type of story. And then as I was getting ready this morning, I was like, okay, that's a little too dark. It had already morphed into them putting their consciousness into other bodies. So you really didn't need that anymore. But that's where the whole thing came from. So, like, there's different trajectories. These three could be active in this story. This one I kind of left behind. This one, where there aren't even men on the planet anymore, could be its own whole story. You can sometimes cast a whole new story. Working through these possibilities and, maybe letting go of one of the trains of possibility and weaving a couple more into one thing, trying to indicate like braided hair here, that you still have this thing sitting here by itself where there's no more men on the planet and the women breed themselves with advanced DNA. Like, that has nothing to do with this story. It's just another whole raw idea that just kind of popped out. So that happens too. So here we have one array of the 36 that can be useful. So things like revolt is very central. Disaster is very central. Daring enterprise, conflict with a god, ambition. Like, some of these are more central than others. And some of these, like, reside at the nucleus of the story, and yet they're still just explosive possibilities. So this one's kind of like a wild card. Like, what would that be? That's interesting. I don't know what to do with that, but I like it. This is the central pile. We're just, looking at which ones are the most active of these, or could be, or should be, like this one could be. It adds some interesting flavor. Deliverance is central to this. The enigma, the riddle, the mystery, what the hell is going on here? How the hell do we get out of here? All that kind of stuff. So that's the 36. Then let's take a quick look at the Enneagram. We'd be looking at, like, what type of personality might our female protagonist be here? Might she be the rational, idealistic type, principled, purposeful, self-controlled, and perfectionistic? That's interesting. That's an interesting possibility for this type of story. No way am I staying where you put me. You don't own me. This is wrong. Not only are we going to escape, but we're going to burn this whole thing down. You guys are monsters. Might she be the caring interpersonal type, generous, demonstrative, people-pleasing, and possessive? Probably not for our main character, but one of the women could certainly be that. The achiever, the success-oriented, pragmatic type, adaptable, excelling, driven, image-conscious, possibly. So let's tag this one as possible. This one could certainly be possible. Who were these women before they got put in this program? And, whether they are like the most perfect genetic specimens so that they're imbuing the race with all these advanced genetic qualities, or were they just some junkie that somebody stole and faked their death, put them in a drug-induced coma and keep getting them pregnant just as breeding machines, where it's not their egg and it's not their anything. They're just the womb, the incubator. But, this person might still have been an advertising executive who got hooked on drugs, fell off the planet, and got kidnapped into this program. In other words, if they think all these women are nobodies, but one of them's a somebody, then she's smart and she's active and she can hack their computer and lead a team and make stuff happen. The individualist, the sensitive withdrawn type, expressive, dramatic, self-absorbed, and temperamental. Probably not for our lead, but probably one of the women could be that. One of them could be that. One of them could be this. We have an interesting array of possibilities. The investigator, the intense cerebral type, perceptive, innovative, secretive, and isolated. That could definitely be Raina, our lead. Interesting possibility. Might she be the loyalist, the committed, security-oriented type, engaging, responsible, anxious, and suspicious? It's possible. It's an interesting possibility. It's a dynamic personality type, can make things happen. In this type of story, our protagonist would be an average to unhealthy type 6, which you get more into the anxious and suspicious and needing guidance and that kind of thing. The enthusiast, the busy, fun-loving type, spontaneous, versatile, acquisitive, and scattered. An interesting type. I don't know if it's the best for our protagonist in this type of story, but it would be great for one of the women. So you can see how we are generating some interesting possibilities for women in the group. Like one of them could be a 7, one of them could be a 4, one of them could be a 2. And whichever one we pick for the protagonist, then these other ones we could use too, or they can be doubled up. This could definitely be our protagonist, the challenger, the powerful, dominating type, self-confident, decisive, willful, and confrontational. That could also be the central villain. That could also be another one of the women in the group. The peacemaker, the easygoing, self-effacing type, receptive, reassuring, agreeable, and complacent. Probably doesn't feel like our protagonist, but could be one of the women. And I'll put this in red ink because that could also be the villain. This could be the villain. This could be the villain. In yellow could be our protagonist. In yellow with red ink could be the antagonist. And in blue could be other women in the creche and the motherboard. And we still don't even have a dilemma yet. So let's look at that, because I know we're coming to the end of the time we have allotted for this class. So these are a set of floating possibilities, and these are catalysts which can trigger ideas. These are a set of floating possibilities. So let's look at potential dilemma for our lead woman. So we would say, she's damned if she doesn't. We can see different ways in which she's damned if she doesn't.
Maybe there could be a reason she has to abort the fetus.
It's possible. She must get out of there. Like you can see how that's quite obvious. Like nothing is making me stay in this hellhole. Holy crap, let me out of here.
But she wants to save the other women in the pod.
Absolutely. And, maybe the babies too, like once they get out of that body, then they're not pregnant anymore. But do they want to bring those bodies along to have their babies? At first, they were pregnant trying to get out. And if they got out, then they would have babies. But then the idea of transplanting brain lobes opened up possibilities so that they were in a different body.
It's just like when people carry babies for other people, they don't recognize the actual connection they're going to have to the baby. And that's why sometimes that falls through.
Right. There's complications with that. Yes. And these are all obvious. In other words, she's a prisoner in solitary. She wants to get the hell out of there. But this is not very complex thinking in terms of dilemma, but these are the first most obvious possibilities for reasons that it's unacceptable to stay in there. And I'm not sure if that's even the right label. It's immensely complicated to get out of there. She might have to sacrifice women in her group. She might be leaving her babies behind in a certain way, like in a very real way, because there might be, a nursery with dozens of babies that are physically hers at different stages of childhood. And the more that she sees what they're doing there, like she sees, like a little daughter going to their kindergarten there, and she's like, oh my God, look at her hair. She has my mom's eyes. How can I leave her behind? That's interesting.
And does she save her family or the families of the others?
It's a moral dilemma. Like in Buddhism is known as a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva achieves enlightenment, but doesn't enter nirvana, but rather comes back to help everybody else. They don't want to enter nirvana until everybody does.
Well, maybe this pod is in outer space and they
It could
only
be.
have enough room to put so many people to escape.
Right. And they may not even discover that until they get out the door. And it's like, we're free. And that's like, holy shit, we're in outer space. Like, whoa, get back inside, close that door. It's like, damn, that's one possibility. She had these kids 14 years ago, and they're now Hitler Youth trying to keep her from getting out of there. So like, that's a dilemma. Does she have to like kill a boy who's the spitting image of her father who died when she was a kid? Like on this kid's face, she hasn't seen her father in 30 years and like, oh my God, that's my dad. And he's trying to kill me. It's complicated. It's interesting. It's dynamic. This is interesting. The things we came up with here were kind of boring, but they were the first most obvious things to grab onto. We can come up with more. We just came up with some richer stuff on this side. But like this was kind of normal. This is normal. But then like that was like, oh, that's interesting. And this is interesting. And this is interesting.
So maybe like when the pod is breached, they only have so much time before it destroys the evidence. And in the end, she has to decide whether to put her family in the escape pod or herself or.
Right. Yeah. And again, that's like one possible scenario. There's easily a dozen possible scenarios. And the essence of this particular class is that you want to feed all of them. You want to hold all of them in suspension and not prematurely go, okay, this is the one I'm doing. Because one of the ideas in this parallel version of it might combine with this thing, and you get something that, wins Best Picture compared to something that's like a rehashed stupid science fiction version or a rehashed thriller. So you really want to explore possibilities and stay fluid as long as you can so that you're not prematurely pouring it in concrete. And it's what Price said, there may be hundreds of plays in the material, so why take the first thing that comes to you? You may get a great drama instead of a superficial one by cross-questioning everything. That's the essence of this class today. So let's see if we can stumble into something a little deeper in Damned If She Doesn't Escape. It's horrifyingly militaristic, cloning, nightmare scenario. Something like that, like we're just amplifying that aspect of it, like when Neo wakes up in that pod in the Matrix and he's covered in gel and he looks around and sees thousands of pods everywhere and realizes he's just part of this whole big slave race that's basically batteries for the robots to generate power with. As she sees what's going on there, it's astonishingly freaky. And it's like, get us out of here. Like, absolutely cannot stick around. And, their own children could be liquidating them. It's like, it's horrifying. So that's just a 5-minute wrestling with potential for dilemma. And once you get a sense of dilemma, then you can look at, okay, so how to type 1 deal with this type of thing. A type 1 has an intense sense of right and wrong and really wants to change things and not let them be the way they are. How would the achiever interact with this dilemma? How would an investigator interact with this dilemma? Because each of them will interact in a often completely different way. An 8 will have a completely different response to that dilemma than a type 2 or a type 1. So once you have dilemma and you can find which personality type your protagonist might be, which personality type your antagonist, what the main players are, that informs the choices that you make. So let's say these are the one sheets for the Enneagram, but let's say that our main character is a type 1. So then what you do, and this is the one sheet from my book, but this comes from the EnneagramInstitute.com. And let me just show you that for a minute, for those of you who aren't aware of it. This is where all my Enneagram material comes from. It's the EnneagramInstitute.com. And here's the 9 types. And you can go in here. And what I have in my book is their stuff from 2006. This is more developed, but it's the same material. But one of the things they have in here is like compatibility with other types. So how does a type 1 like relate to a type 7? And here you get like how they're good for each other, how they clash. So this is a resource that is extremely useful and will take you deeper in. And then the book, The Wisdom of the Enneagram, which is required material for course 1 and course 2 in my program, is a resource that has a 40-page chapter on each of these 9 types. Here we are in the one sheet that's in my book. So if we're looking at our Reina being a rational, idealistic type, principled, purposeful, self-controlled, and perfectionistic, the basic fear, which is very motivating for any of the Enneagram types, is of being corrupt, evil, and defective. And you see how, like, that's interesting. Am I part of this screwed up machine? Am I a monster too? Am I going to end up like them? Am I evil? Am I corrupt? The type 1 doesn't want to be that, doesn't want to be broken, doesn't want to be wrong. They want to be good, to have integrity, and to be balanced, so they can be the idealist or the advocate. Now, what you can do is you're looking at the story in general. We have some 36 dramatic situations like revolt, ambition, conflict with a god, things like that. And all of those are informing the story: daring enterprise, ambition, madness, disaster. And we have a sense of dilemma, and we have story possibilities. So as we go through this, conscientious with strong personal convictions is an interesting trait for this person to have, an intense sense of right and wrong. Personal, it doesn't have to be religious, it could be moral. You can have all this and have religious be like spiritual, or my mom taught me and I know what's right and what's wrong. It doesn't have to be Catholic or Buddhist or Jewish or anything. It can just be, that's not how you treat life. So these are all the healthy aspect, which we probably won't see in our woman waking up out of a drug-induced coma in slavery, potentially chained to the wall, being used as breeding livestock. But some of these things will always be in there. Want to be ethical, truth and justice, primary values, sense of responsibility, integrity, higher purpose. These are built into this person. They're wired this way. It all comes down to like how you're wired and how you're warped, how you were born and how your personality got warped by interacting with all the screwed up stuff. So then in the average aspect, dissatisfied with reality can become high-minded idealists, up to them to improve everything. See how it's like, it's an interesting portrait of a possibilities for what makes this person tick, how they act, how they interact with other people. And these suggest possibilities for how this person operates, how they lead a team, how they come across. And so you can mine this material like, yeah, that's really good in terms of amplifying who this person is, figuring out what they're made of. And then you get into the unhealthy aspects. All of this could be this woman who's leading this escape attempt. She might be an anti-hero. She might be a foul-mouthed, fight dirty, lie, cheat, and she's exactly the person we need for this job, where we may not like her, but we're rooting for her. And the fact that she doesn't take shit from anybody and tells the truth to everybody. She doesn't care about your feelings. She's good in a fight. She has a good sense of mission. And we're like, that's the junkyard dog we need in this fight. We don't need to like this person. We want somebody who can kick ass. So that's what an anti-hero is. I'm assuming most of you know a lot of that stuff, but you don't have to have a likable protagonist. That's a substantial misconception. You have to be able to root for the protagonist and see obsessive about the imperfection and wrongdoings of others. Like what they're doing to us is wildly wrong, but that can also apply to members of her team, the other women in the group, condemnatory towards others, punitive and cruel. They want to get rid of wrongdoers. An unhealthy one can do the opposite of what they preach. So that's an interesting thing. They're prone to severe depressions, nervous breakdowns, suicide attempts. All of these things can be happening during the escape attempt. Like it's going wrong, or it's like, we're never going to get out of here, or those are my babies and I'm never going to see them again, or, you know, those are my babies and no way are we leaving one of them here. It's just a way to explore options, play with things. Some more of the details of this personality type interact with this dilemma, interact with these dramatic situations, interact with the raw story ideas we've been playing with. And this is just scratching the surface, but it's a fun story. It's dynamic. It's out there. It's got a few new elements. It's got several old elements. And the one thing that it doesn't say here, and they attempt to escape by, it doesn't have to be clones of themselves. You know, the woman could inject herself into, you know, a teenage boy. It's just like, there's a body, I'm taking it, we're out of here. It can go any number of ways. I try to not just pick some stupid idea, but I spent some real time on this, trying to come up with something that would be distinct, challenging, fun, deep, complicated, specifically complicated because I was trying to demonstrate how to work with like complicated systems engineering, how to float possibilities as you consider the options and make room for everything. Like we were talking about designing and building a new submarine. You have to have options floating because you might need to shrink the life support system to enhance the weapons communication system. And how do you fit all that thing in a limited space? And how do you adjust and adapt as the design matures and new demands are put into the system? You got to be flexible and free floating and adaptable. And that's the essence of what I'm trying to teach you here.